the new God of salvation, the new gods of salvation, the new God of salvation, the new goddess of salvation, the new goddesses of salvation, the new goddess of salvation, the old God of salvation, the old gods of salvation, the old God of salvation, the old goddess of salvation, the old goddesses of salvation, the old goddess of salvation, the greater God of salvation, the greater gods of salvation, the greater God of salvation, the greater goddess of salvation, the greater goddesses of salvation, the greater goddess of salvation, the lesser God of salvation, the lesser gods of salvation, the lesser God of salvation, the lesser goddess of salvation, the lesser goddesses of salvation, the lesser goddess of salvation, the higher God of salvation, the higher gods of salvation, the higher God of salvation, the higher goddess of salvation, the higher goddesses of salvation, the higher goddess of salvation, the lower God of salvation, the lower gods of salvation, the lower God of salvation, the lower goddess of salvation, the lower goddesses of salvation, the lower goddess of salvation, the greater spirit of salvation, the greater spirits of salvation, the greater spirit of salvation, the lesser spirit of salvation, the lesser spirits of salvation, the lesser spirit of salvation, the higher spirit of salvation, the higher spirits of salvation, the higher spirit of salvation, the lower spirit of salvation, the lower spirits of salvation, the lower spirit of salvation, the major God of salvation, the major gods of salvation, the major God of salvation, the major goddess of salvation, the major goddesses of salvation, the major goddess of salvation, the minor God of salvation, the minor gods of salvation, the minor God of salvation, the minor goddess of salvation, the minor goddesses of salvation, the minor goddess of salvation, the superior God of salvation, the superior gods of salvation, the superior God of salvation, the superior goddess of salvation, the superior goddesses of salvation, the superior goddess of salvation, the inferior God of salvation, the inferior gods of salvation, the inferior God of salvation, the inferior goddess of salvation, the inferior goddesses of salvation, the inferior goddess of salvation, the ancestor God of salvation, the ancestor gods of salvation, the ancestor God of salvation, the ancestor goddess of salvation, the ancestor goddesses of salvation, the ancestor goddess of salvation, the ascendant God of salvation, the ascendant gods of salvation, the ascendant God of salvation, the ascendant goddess of salvation, the ascendant goddesses of salvation, the ascendant goddess of salvation, the descendant God of salvation, the descendant gods of salvation, the descendant God of salvation, the descendant goddess of salvation, the descendant goddesses of salvation, the descendant goddess of salvation, the transcendent God of salvation, the transcendent gods of salvation, the transcendent God of salvation, the transcendent goddess of salvation, the transcendent goddesses of salvation, the transcendent goddess of salvation, the past God of salvation, the past gods of salvation, the past God of salvation, the past goddess of salvation, the past goddesses of salvation, the past goddess of salvation, the present God of salvation, the present gods of salvation, the present God of salvation, the present goddess of salvation, the present goddesses of salvation, the present goddess of salvation, the future God of salvation, the future gods of salvation, the future God of salvation, the future goddess of salvation, the future goddesses of salvation, the future goddess of salvation, the authentic God of salvation, the authentic gods of salvation, the authentic God of salvation, the authentic goddess of salvation, the authentic goddesses of salvation, the authentic goddess of salvation, the synthetic God of salvation, the synthetic gods of salvation, the synthetic God of salvation, the synthetic goddess of salvation, the synthetic goddesses of salvation, the synthetic goddess of salvation, the progressive God of salvation, The progressive gods of salvation. The progressive God of salvation. The progressive goddess of salvation. The progressive goddesses of salvation. The progressive goddess of salvation. The regressive God of salvation. The regressive gods of salvation. The regressive God of salvation. The regressive goddess of salvation. The regressive goddesses of salvation. The regressive goddess of salvation. The ordinary God of salvation. The ordinary gods of salvation. The ordinary God of salvation. The ordinary goddess of salvation. The ordinary goddesses of salvation. The ordinary goddess of salvation. The extraordinary God of salvation. The extraordinary gods of salvation. The extraordinary God of salvation. The extraordinary goddess of salvation. The extraordinary goddesses of salvation. The extraordinary goddess of salvation. The static God of salvation. The static gods of salvation. The static God of salvation. The static goddess of salvation. The static goddesses of salvation. The static goddess of salvation. The dynamic God of salvation. The dynamic gods of salvation. The dynamic God of salvation. The dynamic goddess of salvation. The dynamic goddesses of salvation. The dynamic goddess of salvation. The land God of salvation. The land gods of salvation. The land God of salvation. The land goddess of salvation. The land goddesses of salvation. The land goddess of salvation. The sea God of salvation. The sea gods of salvation. The sea God of salvation. The sea goddess of salvation. The sea goddesses of salvation. The sea goddess of salvation. The sky God of salvation. The sky gods of salvation. The sky God of salvation. The sky goddess of salvation. The sky goddesses of salvation. The sky goddess of salvation. The God of salvation. The gods of salvation. The God of salvation. The goddess of salvation. The goddesses of salvation. The goddess of salvation. The half God of salvation. The half gods of salvation. The half God of salvation. The half goddess of salvation. The half goddesses of salvation. The half goddess of salvation. The vessel of salvation. The vessels of salvation. The vessel of salvation. The name of salvation. The names of salvation. The name of salvation. The person of salvation. The persons of salvation. The person of salvation. The persona of salvation. The personas of salvation. The persona of salvation. The personage of salvation. The personages of salvation. The personage of salvation. The personality of salvation. The personalities of salvation. The personality of salvation. The personification of salvation. The personifications of salvation. The personification of salvation. The image of salvation. The images of salvation. The image of salvation. The imagination of salvation. The imaginations of salvation. The imagination of salvation. The belief of salvation. The beliefs of salvation. The belief of salvation. The thought of salvation. The thoughts of salvation. The thought of salvation. The word of salvation. The words of salvation. The word of salvation. The action of salvation. The actions of salvation. The action of salvation. The reaction of salvation. The reactions of salvation. The reaction of salvation. The feeling of salvation. The feelings of salvation. The feeling of salvation. The situation of salvation. The situations of salvation. The situation of salvation. The circumstance of salvation. The circumstances of salvation. The circumstance of salvation. The environment of salvation. The environments of salvation. The environment of salvation. The relationship of salvation. The relationships of salvation. The relationship of salvation. The number of salvation. The numbers of salvation. The number of salvation. The formula of salvation. The formulas of salvation. The formula of salvation. The equation of salvation. The equations of salvation. The equation of salvation. The theory of salvation. The theories of salvation. The theory of salvation. The symbol of salvation. the symbols of salvation, the symbol of salvation, the color of salvation, the colors of salvation, the color of salvation, the thing of salvation, the things of salvation, the thing of salvation, the way of salvation, the ways of salvation, the way of salvation, the place of salvation, the places of salvation, the place of salvation, the time of salvation, the times of salvation, the time of salvation, the event of salvation, the events of salvation, the event of salvation, the result of salvation, the results of salvation, the result of salvation, the crown of salvation, the crowns of salvation, the crown of salvation, the throne of salvation, the thrones of salvation, the throne of salvation, the salvation king, the salvation kings, the salvation kingdom, the salvation kingdoms, the salvation king's subject, the salvation king's subjects, the salvation king's dominion, the salvation king's dominions, the kingdom of salvation, the kingdoms of salvation, the kingdom of salvation, the salvation queen, the salvation queens, the salvation queendom, the salvation queendoms, the salvation queen's subject, the salvation queen's subjects, the salvation queen's dominion, the salvation queen's dominions, the queendom of salvation, the queendoms of salvation, the queendom of salvation, the salvation prince, the salvation princes, the salvation princedom, the salvation princedoms, the salvation prince's subject, the salvation prince's subjects, the salvation prince's dominion, the salvation prince's dominions, the princedom of salvation, the princedoms of salvation, the princedom of salvation, the salvation princess, the salvation princesses, the salvation princessdom, the salvation princessdoms, the salvation princess's subject, the salvation princess's subjects, the salvation princess's dominion, the salvation princess's dominions, the princessdom of salvation, the princessdoms of salvation, the princessdom of salvation, the Lord of salvation, the lords of salvation, the Lord of salvation, the Lordess of salvation, the Lordesses of salvation, the Lordess of salvation, the priest of salvation, the priests of salvation, the priest of salvation, the priestess of salvation, the priestesses of salvation, the priestess of salvation, the ritual of salvation, the rituals of salvation, the ritual of salvation, the shrine of salvation, the shrines of salvation, the shrine of salvation, the temple of salvation, the temples of salvation, the temple of salvation, the leader of salvation, the leaders of salvation, the leader of salvation, the follower of salvation, the followers of salvation, the follower of salvation, the natural substance of salvation, the natural substances of salvation, the natural substance of salvation, the supernatural substance of salvation, the supernatural substances of salvation, the supernatural substance of salvation, the temporal substance of salvation, the temporal substances of salvation, the temporal substance of salvation, the spiritual substance of salvation, the spiritual substances of salvation, the spiritual substance of salvation, the natural form of salvation, the natural forms of salvation, the natural form of salvation, the supernatural form of salvation, the supernatural forms of salvation, the supernatural form of salvation, the temporal form of salvation, the temporal forms of salvation, the temporal form of salvation, the spiritual form of salvation, the spiritual forms of salvation, the spiritual form of salvation, the age of salvation, the ages of salvation, the age of salvation, the era of salvation, the heiress of salvation, the era of salvation, the awakener of salvation, the awakeners of salvation, the awakener of salvation, the awakening of salvation, the awakenings of salvation, the awakening of salvation, the realm of salvation, the realms of salvation, the realm of salvation, the dimension of salvation, the dimensions of salvation, the dimension of salvation, the zone of salvation, the zones of salvation, the zone of salvation, the frequency of salvation, the frequencies of salvation, the frequency of salvation, the century of salvation, the centuries of salvation, the century of salvation, the millennium of salvation, the millenniums of salvation, the millennium of salvation, the purpose of salvation, the purposes of salvation, the purpose of salvation, the meaning of salvation, the meanings of salvation, the meaning of salvation, the culture of salvation, the cultures of salvation, the culture of salvation, the demonstrator of salvation, the demonstrators of salvation, the demonstrator of salvation, the demonstration of salvation, the demonstrations of salvation, the demonstration of salvation, the manifester of salvation, the manifestors of salvation, the manifester of salvation, the manifestation of salvation, the manifestations of salvation, the manifestation of salvation, the presence of salvation, the presences of salvation, the presence of salvation, the glow of salvation, the glows of salvation, the glow of salvation, the goal of salvation, the goals of salvation, the goal of salvation, the plan of salvation, the plans of salvation, the plan of salvation, the book of salvation, the books of salvation, the book of salvation, the philosopher of salvation, the philosophers of salvation, the philosopher of salvation, the philosophy of salvation, the philosophies of salvation, the philosophy of salvation, the releaser of salvation, the releasers of salvation, the releaser of salvation, the release of salvation, the releases of salvation, the release of salvation, the variable of salvation, the variables of salvation, the variable of salvation, the cause of salvation, the causes of salvation, the cause of salvation, the effect of salvation, the effects of salvation, the effect of salvation, the journey of salvation, the journeys of salvation, the journey of salvation, the emergence of salvation, the emergences of salvation, the emergence of salvation, the source of salvation, the sources of salvation, the source of salvation, the originator of salvation, the originators of salvation, the originator of salvation, the origin of salvation, the origins of salvation, the origin of salvation, the forefather of salvation, the forefathers of salvation, the forefather of salvation, the foremother of salvation, the foremothers of salvation, the foremother of salvation, the ancestor of salvation, the ancestors of salvation, the ancestor of salvation, the descendant of salvation, the descendants of salvation, the descendant of salvation, the lineage of salvation, the lineages of salvation, the lineage of salvation, the heritage of salvation, the heritages of salvation, the heritage of salvation, the heir of salvation, the heirs of salvation, the heir of salvation, the co-heir of salvation, the co-heirs of salvation, the co-heir of salvation, the joint heir of salvation, the joint heirs of salvation, the joint heir of salvation, the dynasty of salvation, the dynasties of salvation, the dynasty of salvation, the force of salvation, the forces of salvation, the force of salvation, the law of salvation, the laws of salvation, the law of salvation, the pact of salvation, the pacts of salvation, the pact of salvation, the game of salvation, the games of salvation, the game of salvation, the mask of salvation, the masks of salvation, the mask of salvation, the armor of salvation, the armors of salvation, the armor of salvation, the sword of salvation, the swords of salvation, the sword of salvation, the shield of salvation, the shields of salvation, the shield of salvation, the force shield of salvation, the force shields of salvation, the force shield of salvation, the armored force shield of salvation, the armored force shields of salvation, the armored force shield of salvation, the champion of salvation, the champions of salvation, the champion of salvation, the guardian of salvation, the guardians of salvation, the guardian of salvation, the defender of salvation, the defenders of salvation, the defender of salvation, the protector of salvation, the protectors of salvation, the protector of salvation, the chant of salvation, the chants of salvation, the chant of salvation, the shape of salvation, the shapes of salvation, the shape of salvation, the cube of salvation, the cubes of salvation, the cube of salvation, the cuboid of salvation, the cuboids of salvation, the cuboid of salvation, the sphere of salvation, the spheres of salvation, the sphere of salvation, the spheroid of salvation, the spheroids of salvation, the spheroid of salvation, the prism of salvation, the prisms of salvation, the prism of salvation, the pyramid of salvation, the pyramids of salvation, the pyramid of salvation, the cylinder of salvation, the cylinders of salvation, the cylinder of salvation, the cone of salvation, the cones of salvation, the cone of salvation, the triangle of salvation, the triangles of salvation, the triangle of salvation, the circle of salvation, the circles of salvation, the circle of salvation, the semicircle of salvation, the semicircles of salvation, the semicircle of salvation, the square of salvation, the squares of salvation, the square of salvation, the rectangle of salvation, the rectangles of salvation, the rectangle of salvation, the parallelogram of salvation, the parallelograms of salvation, the parallelogram of salvation, the rhombus of salvation, the rhombuses of salvation, the rhombus of salvation, the trapezoid of salvation, the trapezoids of salvation, the trapezoid of salvation, the polygon of salvation, the polygons of salvation, the polygon of salvation, the pentagon of salvation, the pentagons of salvation, the pentagon of salvation, the hexagon of salvation, the hexagons of salvation, the hexagon of salvation, the septagon of salvation, the septagons of salvation, the septagon of salvation, the octagon of salvation, the octagons of salvation, the octagon of salvation, the nonagon of salvation, the nonagons of salvation, the nonagon of salvation, the decagon of salvation, the decagons of salvation, the decagon of salvation, the evolution of salvation, the evolutions of salvation, the evolution of salvation, the revolution of salvation, the revolutions of salvation, the revolution of salvation, the elemental art of salvation, the elemental arts of salvation, the elemental art of salvation, the elemental science of salvation, the elemental sciences of salvation, the elemental science of salvation, the elemental principle of salvation, the elemental principles of salvation, the elemental principle of salvation, the elemental technology of salvation, the elemental technologies of salvation, the elemental technology of salvation, the low elemental art of salvation, the low elemental arts of salvation, the low elemental art of salvation, the low elemental science of salvation, the low elemental sciences of salvation, the low elemental science of salvation, the low elemental principle of salvation, the low elemental principles of salvation, the low elemental principle of salvation, the low elemental technology of salvation, the low elemental technologies of salvation, the low elemental technology of salvation, the high elemental art of salvation, the high elemental arts of salvation, the high elemental art of salvation, the high elemental science of salvation, the high elemental sciences of salvation, the high elemental science of salvation, the high elemental principle of salvation, the high elemental principles of salvation, the high elemental principle of salvation, the high elemental technology of salvation, the high elemental technologies of salvation, the high elemental technology of salvation, the agent of salvation, the agents of salvation, the agent of salvation, the agency of salvation, the agencies of salvation, the agency of salvation, the amplifier of salvation, the amplifiers of salvation, the amplifier of salvation, the amplification of salvation, the amplifications of salvation, the amplification of salvation, the enhancer of salvation, the enhancers of salvation, the enhancer of salvation, the enhancement of salvation, the enhancements of salvation, the enhancement of salvation, the magnifier of salvation, the magnifiers of salvation, the magnifier of salvation, the magnification of salvation, the magnifications of salvation, the magnification of salvation, the influencer of salvation, the influencers of salvation, the influencer of salvation, the influence of salvation, the influences of salvation, the influence of salvation, the emanator of salvation, the emanators of salvation, the emanator of salvation, the emanation of salvation, the emanations of salvation, the emanation of salvation, the converger of salvation, the convergers of salvation, the converger of salvation, the convergence of salvation, the convergences of salvation, the convergence of salvation, the aura of salvation, the auras of salvation, the aura of salvation, the impression of salvation, the impressions of salvation, the impression of salvation, the intelligence of salvation, the intelligences of salvation, the intelligence of salvation, the sophistication of salvation, the sophistications of salvation, the sophistication of salvation, the genius of salvation, the geniuses of salvation, the genius of salvation, the polymath of salvation, the polymaths of salvation, the polymath of salvation, the psychic of salvation, the psychics of salvation, the psychic of salvation, the knowledge of salvation, the knowledges of salvation, the knowledge of salvation, the understanding of salvation, the understandings of salvation, the understanding of salvation, the wisdom of salvation, the wisdoms of salvation, the wisdom of salvation, the secret of salvation, the secrets of salvation, the secret of salvation, the mystery of salvation, the mysteries of salvation, the mystery of salvation, the revelation of salvation, the revelations of salvation, the revelation of salvation, the tactic of salvation, the tactics of salvation, the tactic of salvation, the strategy of salvation, the strategies of salvation, the strategy of salvation, the strength of salvation, the strengths of salvation, the strength of salvation, the might of salvation, the mights of salvation, the might of salvation, the power of salvation, the powers of salvation, the power of salvation, the authority of salvation, the authorities of salvation, the authority of salvation, the dominion of salvation, the dominions of salvation, the dominion of salvation, the rhythm of salvation, the rhythms of salvation, the rhythm of salvation, the melody of salvation, the melodies of salvation, the melody of salvation, the music of salvation, the musics of salvation, the music of salvation, the lyric of salvation, the lyrics of salvation, the lyric of salvation, the song of salvation, the songs of salvation, the song of salvation, the dance of salvation, the dances of salvation, the dance of salvation, the spirit of salvation, the spirits of salvation, the spirit of salvation, the soul of salvation, the souls of salvation, the soul of salvation, the body of salvation, the bodies of salvation, the body of salvation, the mark of salvation, the marks of salvation, the mark of salvation, the promise of salvation, the promises of salvation, the promise of salvation, the visionary of salvation, the visionaries of salvation, the visionary of salvation, the vision of salvation, the visions of salvation, the vision of salvation, the picture of salvation, the pictures of salvation, the picture of salvation, the sound of salvation, the sounds of salvation, the sound of salvation, the dung of salvation, the dungs of salvation, the dung of salvation, The language of salvation. The languages of salvation. The language of salvation. The communication of salvation. The communications of salvation. The communication of salvation. The people of salvation. The peoples of salvation. The people of salvation. The society of salvation. The societies of salvation. The society of salvation. The fortress of salvation. The fortresses of salvation. The fortress of salvation. The government of salvation. The governments of salvation. The government of salvation. The city of salvation. The cities of salvation. The city of salvation. The nation of salvation. The nations of salvation. The nation of salvation. The civilization of salvation. The civilizations of salvation. The civilization of salvation. The world of salvation. The worlds of salvation. The world of salvation.